So Mike, you and I started working on harvest weed seed control at the end of the 90s, and we were working largely on windrow burning and chaff carts a bit at that time. And since that time, we've seen a lot of adoption of other practices. As we said in the course, there's now 6 different harvest weed seed control practices. So just like to have a bit of a discussion about how to choose those practices. So firstly, narrow windrow burning. It's the most popular one, and it is probably the easiest for farmers to adopt. What are your thoughts about where narrow windrow burning fits, and should farmers be focusing on using narrow windrow burning for the long term, or is that just a bit of a proof of concept and then they should look to other practices?
Yeah, that's a good point, Pete. When we first started talking about narrow windrow burning all those years ago, we said it's a temporary thing that growers should try and see if harvest weed seed control works before moving on to something else. And I guess the same still applies, that we don't see it as a long-term sustainable thing, long-term sustainable practice because of the nutrient issues. But it definitely is a great place to start because it is a cheap, simple, and as we now know, a very effective system to try out.
So do you think narrow windrow burning has a particular farming system that it really suits?
Yeah, I do. I think that it probably suits farming systems where the yields or cereal yields are not necessarily all that high. So we talk about being a 3 tonne yielding crop as the upper limit for burning windrows in cereals. But on the other hand, of course, you can use narrow windrow burning quite freely in non-cereal crops. So I guess if you've got a farming system that's more focused on those non-cereals compared to cereals, then that would be the emphasis. But yeah, higher yielding cereal cropping systems are not a recommended practice for narrow windrow burning.
All right, so Mike, the ones that focus on all the residue, narrow windrow burning, as we've just spoken about, but the Bale Direct, you've also worked on Bale Direct and measured really high seed delivery into the Bale Direct system. Where does the Bale Direct fit, and have you seen it in action much around the country?
So yeah, the Bale Direct system has some level of adoption. We know that 3% of growers nationally are using that system. It does involve all residue removal, similar to the narrow windrow burning system, but the benefit there, of course, is that the product that's produced is a saleable product, a marketable product. The downside, of course, is that you actually need a market for that product. Both complete residue removal systems require nutrient inputs accordingly. So if you're going to be removing all the residues, then you have to make the calculations on just how much nutrients you are also removing from the paddock.
I guess one of the benefits though is if you've got these systems that remove all the residue, you don't have to set the harvester up much at all, do you? You know that what is in the harvester is going to end up in that windrow or in that bale, so there's not many modifications in the harvester setup, is there?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Pete. So you don't have to be as particular about where the weed seeds are exiting the harvester, whether it's the chaff or the straw. You're dealing with all those residues, so it's all good. However, if you're focusing on just the chaff residue, then you do need to pay attention to your harvester setup and make sure that all the weed seeds are coming out in that chaff fraction.
So the ones that focus on the chaff is the chaff cart, chaff lining, chaff tram lining, and the integrated Harrington seed destructor. So we're just talking about 10 to 20% of the residue in the paddock being in that chaff fraction. We've got to set the harvester up to get the weed seeds in that chaff fraction. Now yourself and John Broster did some research in that area, didn't you, about maximising weed seeds that end up in the chaff fraction. What did you find there?
It was a fairly cursory look, but essentially what we found was that if you're going too fast, putting too much material through the harvester, then you tended to get more weed seeds coming out the back in the straw fraction. So obviously your chaff collection systems or chaff management systems are less effective. Similarly, if you didn't have the harvester settings set up appropriately, then you tended to get more residue coming out in the straw fraction as well, including the weed seeds.
So 4 of the harvest weed seed control systems are just focused on the chaff. So we're talking chaff lining, chaff tram lining, chaff cart, and integrated Harrington seed destructor. Now if we're going to use those, we need to focus on getting weed seeds into that chaff fraction. So any tips for growers out there about how to maximise weed seeds in the chaff fraction? We don't want them going out with the rotor. How do we get them in the chaff?
Yeah, it's a very good point, Pete. So really it's all about attention to detail with the harvester setup. So you're not just collecting the grain, you're also manipulating the residue so that you get the weed seeds coming out in the chaff fraction and not going out in the straw fraction as well.
So I've learned a lot from Ray Harrington over the years. He talks about threshing it hard enough. He talks about opening the grates up to get the weed seeds on the sieves, and then we don't have the wind too high to blow everything out the back. And also sometimes we have a baffle in the harvester to capture stuff that's coming off the sieve. So there's a lot in harvester setup, but we can't, it's very hard to describe talking about it, isn't it? But I guess it's just a point that if you're using a system that's just focused on the chaff, there's some harvester setup to make sure that the weed seeds end up in that chaff fraction.
Yeah, no, exactly right. So if you're going to go to the trouble of adopting a harvest weed seed control system, then you have to pay attention to what you're actually doing. So if you're focusing on that chaff fraction to destroy the weed seeds, then you really do have to manage the harvester setup to make sure the weed seeds are coming out of the rotors, down onto the sieves and then out in that chaff stream.
So it's really exciting that we've got the integrated Harrington seed destructors out there. This is the first harvest. There's over 10 machines working around the country. An exciting development after a long period of development. What have you seen with the integrated destructors, Mike, and how are they going out in the field?
Yeah, it is exciting times, Pete. It's a great innovation and it's something that's now got international attention, which is a fantastic story for Australian growers, that something that's evolved here is actually going to go to the rest of the world. And by all means, this harvest has been a proving ground for the integrated seed destructors. There have been minor issues at best. They are proving their worth completely during the harvest operation, and it is looking very positive for the future of this technology. Yeah,
and I've seen it in action and it's going really well in my part of the world. But I guess that sort of begs the question, doesn't it? What's the future of harvest weed seed control? So our surveys have told us that 43% of farmers are currently using harvest weed seed control. It took us about 15 to 20 years to get to that point. The survey tells us that in the next 5 years there'll be 80% of farmers using harvest weed seed control. It's very exciting that we have a tool like the Destructor, but it does come with a big price tag. And then right at the other end, we have a really cheap tool like chaff lining, which is inexpensive but doesn't have the science. So where do you see the future of harvest weed seed control for farmers? Is it a choice of any one of those six, or do you see it going more towards one tool than the other?
It's an interesting thing, and I think there won't be a one-size-fits-all. It never is in farming. Certainly there's a lot of interest in the seed destructor, and admittedly there is a cost associated with that, a capital cost. But it is the system that I think a lot of growers would like to use but need to be convinced of harvest weed seed control initially. Similarly, chaff tram lining, very suitable in just managing the chaff material, but again need to be convinced of the efficacy of those systems. So there's a little bit of research to be done yet. But look, I think overall those are probably the two systems that will dominate in the future. Removes the need for burning. The seed destructor in particular is completely compatible with conservation cropping systems. Chaff tram lining compatible with farmers who have tram lining systems. So look, I think those two will be the dominant tools of choice.
All right, thanks Mike. It's been a great 20 years so far. Looking forward to the next 20.
Yeah, we've still got work to do, Pete.
Yeah, we've still got another 20 years of work to do, I think.